Hello, I'm Pete Devlin, your host in this episode of Access Door County. Now, we happen to have a pretty interesting collection in this room right now. There's only three of us, including the man behind the camera, but all three of us are Vietnam vets, including the man sitting beside me, Richard Biz Verley, who is a resident of the town of Sevastopol, a native of Door County, a retired Door County Sheriff's deputy. And before that, you were in Vietnam, and I believe we probably did run into each other in Vietnam, Biz, because you guys in your Brownwater Navy. Let's start with what Brownwater Navy is, I guess. And since you were, you could explain it better than me.
Well, the Brownwater Navy it got that name because of I was stationed at Can Tho, right on the Mekong River. And the Mekong River comes down out of Laos and all the way through Vietnam and flows into the South China Sea. And of course, that water is brown compared to the ocean.
Yeah.
And when I was sent there, I was in communications in the Navy, and they sent my group there to set up a communications for the riverboats on the Mekong River. And they would go down the river or up the river trying to pick up survivors from units that were shot up, and of course they would get a lot of firepower from the banks, and they needed help on that. So we set up the communication stations at the airfield in Can Tho, and the name of the unit was ATCU. That's Air Transportable Communication Units, which are four vans, and four diesel six-cylinder generators for the power. And we built that, put the antennas up and sandbagged all the vans in for protection. And then the riverboats could call on that communications and get air support.
And I was one of those guys who got overpowered on land. I was infantry, and we did the Mekong River as well, and you guys picked us up. Occasionally, you'd actually drop us off, and we were over there at about the same time. So I guess we probably met over there, and
yeah, very likely
didn't know each other then for 45 years afterward.
Yeah.
So you were in communications. You were Navy. I was Army. Our producer, cameraman, etc., is also Army. So I don't know. We could sit here and talk about Vietnam for a couple hours, but actually, and I'll let you talk about some of the things because you got some really interesting photographs there that you're going to share with us.
Well, this is a picture of me. I was getting ready to go to work that morning and got my picture snapped. We were living in a villa right on the river, and we would get in a deuce-and-a-half truck and drive over to the airfield to work on our communication stuff. And they issued us greens in those days. I was in the Navy, but I maybe looked like an Army guy, but yeah. I was in the Navy, and
the hat's different. We in the Army never had a hat like that.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I had an M14 rifle with a 20-shot clip and a 1911 45 caliber handgun.
Yeah.
And of course, all the guns came with a bayonet and stuff. So.
You guys had better weapons. Well, that's in hindsight. You guys had better weapons with the 14 than we did with the M16. That was not it was at that time the technology was such that it wasn't really a good weapon to be going into ambushes with. But well, I'm still here 50 years later, so I guess it was adequate. Yeah. Now you also have a picture of you in your whites.
Yeah, this picture was taken on board the USS Porterfield, which is a Fletcher-class destroyer. 682 is a hull number. And there was a changing command aboard the Porterfield. We were docked in Yokosuka, Japan, and there was a changing of the guard that morning. So of course everyone had to be dressed in whites, their white uniform. And this was taken in the last year that I was in the Navy, and I was at that point I was a E4, a third class petty officer, radio operator, and. Yeah, that picture was taken on the Porterfield, the deck of the Porterfield. We were moored right alongside another destroyer in our group in Yokosuka, Japan.
And what year was that, if you remember?
That was in 1967. I went in the Navy in December of '63, and I got out at the end of December of '67. So I did 4 years. Did boot camp in San Diego, and did the Class A radio school, which was a half a year. That was also in San Diego. And then they shipped me to Japan for a couple of years, but then I got sidetracked, sent into Vietnam to help set up that communication station.
Yeah, that is the time I was there. I was there in '67 also.
Yeah. So I had 3 years of actual shore duty, and then my last year was aboard the destroyer. So and we did our training off the coast of San Diego, and then went back overseas, right over in the Tonkin Gulf in South China Sea, and did air support for the USS Constellation, an attack carrier, CVA carrier, and very busy in those days. The sorority flights were day and night, steady. And the only break you got is when you went out to sea to rendezvous with a supply ship and take on fuel and take on ammunition and stores, groceries, and then right back on the line back in the South China Sea.
Yeah. So I gotta ask, did you ever try Bami Ba?
No, I don't think so.
Bami Ba was a local beer. Actually, I think it was more like bottled formaldehyde. It was not the most delicious beer, but it was only beer sometimes available. In fact, I know I'm getting off the subject here, but we were actually ambushed alongside a road. And so here's my entire platoon laying down in the ditch on the side of the road. And here comes a woman from the nearby village with 2 of her children, mama-san and baby-san, as we called them. She's carrying, the children are each carrying a case of liquid refreshment. One was Bami Ba beer, and the other was Coca-Cola. And this woman had 1 glass, a block of ice, and she would come down this line, and we're exchanging gunfire. And she's selling us a glass of Coke or a glass of beer. 10 cents is what it costs. And when she only had the 1 glass, so she'd wait right standing there while bullets are flying for the glass to get emptied. She'd sort of rub it around and then go on to the next person. Hey, you want Coca-Cola? You want Bami Ba? So anyway, you're lucky you didn't miss anything with Bami Ba. and so I will stop digressing here. So you came back to the States and you put on a different uniform, huh?
Yeah, as I said, I got out and right at the end of December of '67, and I kind of had my heart set on joining the sheriff department. And I had talked to, actually it was the undersheriff at that time, which was Baldy Breidenhagen,
Yeah.
because his wife Gloria at that time was sheriff. In those days, you could only run 2 terms, and then you couldn't run. So Baldy had his wife run, and Gloria got elected, and she appointed him undersheriff. So I talked to him about a job. He asked me, about my service and what I did, and I told him I was in communications, and he said, well, there's just no openings, but he said, you can fill out an application, and at that time, everything was civil service. You can, write the exam, and when there is an opening, we could look at you for hiring you. So I went to the Door County Library in Sturgeon Bay to get a civil service book, to study for the exam, and that's when I met the librarian, Sharon Jensen. And Sharon told me that she did not have a civil service book, but she could get one from the Brown County Library, and when it came in, she would call me. Which she did. A few days later, she called and said that she had the book and I could pick it up. So I went down there and picked it up, and in a conversation with her, I asked her if she'd like to go to a movie with me, and she said sure. And that's when it started. And
Smooth talking devil, huh?
yeah, and eventually we dated for a year, and in December of '68 we married. So that's Sharon Jensen Verley now, and we've been married for 48 years.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
yeah, that's where that started, and eventually, a gentleman by the name of John McCuskey, he was an elderly gentleman working at the sheriff department, and he was a radio operator and jailer, and he got sick and suddenly, within a few days, died. And that created an opening, and then eventually I got hired at the sheriff department in '68.
Okay.
So, and I retired in '98, so I had 30 years there. And this picture is a picture of me in my last, Keita Steves took this picture. And I was in my, if not the last day on the job, it was in the last week when this picture was taken. And the cell that I'm standing by is upstairs in the old jail, which is all torn down, but they saved one cell, and it's in the Door County Museum on 4th Avenue.
Yeah.
If you go into the Pioneer part where the fire trucks are, they got a jail cell in there, and that's one of these cells.
I gotta ask you, do you still fit into that uniform?
No, I don't think so.
The only reason I'm asking is since the cell still exists, we could do another picture, couldn't we?
Yeah.
The producer's saying, yeah, we could.
So over 30 years, I had a pretty interesting career in law enforcement.
You were predominantly a jailer for that 30 years, right?
Yeah, radio operator jailer. At the time, the communications was run by the sheriff department, and of course we had the jail. But in those days, Baldy was undersheriff, and he only had 5 deputies under him. There were the 4 radio operator jailers, and then a sergeant, and that was it. That's all there was under the sheriff. And that was in 1968. And I believe it was in 1970, 2 years later, the county board decided to merge the Door County Sheriff's Office and take over the Door County Traffic Department, which was under Muzz Millard. He was the captain, and there was about a dozen patrolmen. And at that time, the county board put all of that under the sheriff. So he went from 5 people to nearly 20 at that time, and took over all the communications, of course, for Door County Sheriff's Office and the Sturgeon Bay Police Department, which is yet today. They do all the communications for both. And then that ended the Door County Traffic Department. It all became Door County Sheriff Department the way it is today.
Now, I've heard a number of legendary stories about Baldy. I met the man once or twice. But the one that I loved the most, I guess, was how he could handle any outbreak of crime north of Sturgeon Bay. If they were looking for a suspect, they just put the bridge up. That's what I've heard that story. Is that what he did?
Well, I can remember when there was they were looking for a suspect that had cut a body up. They had all the parts. It was cut up with a chainsaw. And they knew that he was in northern Door County. And I'm not saying that they put the bridge up, But they said that car, they knew the kind of car that he had, and that car, to leave the county, was going to have to go across that bridge or leave on by boat.
Yeah.
And so part of that's true. They had the sheriff department stationed at the bridge and watching for that car.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the car actually got all the way to the bridge. I think it was spotted somewhere right up in this area of Institute. I think they were down by the farm. I think that's where they actually stopped the car and took the man into custody. So part of that is true. But yeah, Baldy was, and of course he passed away in office. He got sick and passed away. But he was quite a sheriff.
Yeah, he was. I'm told. When I met him, it was. I was working in radio news down in Green Bay at the time, and Norb Freilich was the sheriff in Brown County, and they used to get together apparently on a couple of time a month basis, just to compare notes. And I happened to be present at a couple of those times when they were comparing notes, and usually a beer or two.
Sure.
Yeah. So you were in your position within the sheriff's department or the sheriff's traffic department, or whichever it was. What are some of the more interesting moments in your career?
Well, early in my career, I served under 4 different sheriffs, but under Sheriff Baldy Breidenhagen, I believe it was right around 70 or 71. It was on a Sunday, and they picked up 2 suspects that were charged with burglary. The Wilson brothers.
Okay.
I remember them pretty clearly. 2 young men, and they were breaking into homes here in Sevastopol, and they found them and corralled them and arrested them and brought them to the jail. And it was on a Sunday, and I was working then and booked them into the jail. And in those days, things were run, I guess, kind of loose. Usually, we didn't have visiting hours on a Sunday afternoon, but the sheriff, their girlfriends came in and wanted to talk to their boyfriends. And the sheriff told me, yeah, you can put them in that room and put the girls on the other side of the glass and let them visit, which I did. And they were there for a while, and then they left, and I put them back in the jail in their cell. And when I got off duty at 3 o'clock, I'm sure that they were there in the jail, but the next 2 shifts, the 3 to 11 shift and the 11 to 7 shift, they were there when they fed them at supper time. But in the morning, when they went to serve breakfast, they were gone. And one of the windows on the north side of the jail, the bars were sawed out, and there was a jailbreak. They escaped. They made it across the street to where, today the fire department is there, but back in those days it was the Sturgeon Bay High School. And a janitor had stopped there to check things, and he left his car running and went in to check a couple things, and when he came out, the car was gone. And the Wilsons went across the street, and they had stole that car and left town. And the next day, when I came to work in the morning at 7, and they realized the Wilsons had escaped, the Sheriff Baldy was pretty excited. I think you could hear him downtown yelling of how in the world this ever happened.
Yeah.
And it turned out that the girlfriends made this plan with their boyfriends when they visited, and they went downtown to a local gas station, and it was actually Sargent's gas station, and Mr. Sargent, the girls gave a song and dance story that they needed a hacksaw, they needed a pipe wrench, and a few other tools, and they wanted to borrow it. And then when they said they promised they would bring it all back when they were finished. Well, obviously they went up to the jail and passed these tools through the window, and they sawed their way out and escaped.
Did Mr. Sargent get his tools back?
I think that he eventually did. We gave him his hacksaw, and that stuff was all laying there when they escaped. But, you know, obviously we issued warrants for them.
Yeah.
And of course, we didn't know it at the time, but they were already out of state. And then we found out, within a few days later, that they did an armed robbery I believe if it wasn't in St. Louis, it was right down in that area of a gas station. And there was a shootout, and one of the Wilson boys was shot and died from the wounds. And the other one was captured and wound up in prison. And we never got him back in Door County.
Okay.
We never got him
That
back.
was going to be my next question.
But that escape in 70 or 71 was a pretty big deal at the time.
Yeah, and you were pretty much still a rookie at that point too, so.
Sure, and of course, security at the jail tightened up a lot after that,
Yeah.
because you know, in those days, we didn't even lock them in their cells, so they could go up and down the hallway and right to the access to them outside windows. Where then after that, at night, usually right around 9 or 10 o'clock, they had to go in their cell and be locked in the cell. And then they wouldn't have had access to those outside windows. So, you know, that all changed then, but it taught us that you had to be more careful.
In your career in the jail, did you ever have an Otis character like in the Andy Griffith Show that would let himself into the cell and then in the morning he'd let himself out?
No, but there was situations like before I got hired where,
Yeah.
but we had humor law people where they spent time in jail, but they were left out for their job and then their 8 hours of work, and then had to come back to the jail.
Okay.
And that humor law is still yet today,
Yeah.
where, and it's a good deal because they can be more self-supporting and pay their way, where if they're just in jail and they're not working, well, then the taxpayers are feeding them and taking care of their medical.
We're talking, by the way, with Richard Biz Verley. He is a member of the County Board of Supervisors now. He's a retired Door County Sheriff's Deputy. He's a Vietnam vet who served in the Navy over in the brown water areas, which is along the Mekong River. And he's just an interesting character. So we're having fun just talking about it. The idea for this came to me probably 5-6 years ago, that we would like to track down some retired law enforcement people and just talk about some of the experiences they had while wearing a uniform. The first one that I was talking to my son about this idea at a restaurant just outside of Madison. There was an older couple at the next table. And they overheard the conversation, and he said, well, I'm a retired police officer. And he then, right at that point, provided one of his most memorable experiences. He was a sheriff's deputy in the Madison area. And he recalled the night that a car was speeding on Highway 151, and he pulled it over, only to discover that the guy was trying to get to the hospital because his wife was in labor. And so he says, I got on the radio, and this is back 40 years ago. There weren't any other backups nearby. He says, I called for help, and then as I'm waiting for somebody to show up, this car pulls in behind, and the guy gets out, and he says, I'm the doctor. He says, what doctor? I'm their doctor. And so the doctor and the officer delivered the baby on the side of the road. And that was a pretty neat story that got me started on this idea. Now, this is the first one we're doing, is this with Biz. I hope that we have others who come in and tell us their stories of law enforcement as well. The most memorable moment of your involvement was what? Was it the Wilson brothers, or?
No, actually, over 30 years' time, there were no deaths in the 30 years I worked there in the jail. But there were 4 attempted suicides that I can remember. And they're pretty clear in my mind because they were pretty big deal at the time. The first one, and this was under Sheriff Breidenhagen, we booked a young man into the jail. He was charged, I don't even remember what his charge was, but he was booked in the jail. And in those days, they could have matches and cigarettes in their cell, which is not allowed today, but that in those days it was allowed. So he was in a holding cell. We had 3 of them, holding cells. And it was kind of a routine shift. It wasn't a lot going on. And some hours later, after he was booked into the jail, we could smell smoke. And all of a sudden, we heard a prisoner yelling. And I went back and by this holding cell and looked. I couldn't believe my eyes. Over in the area where the toilet was, flames were going up all the way to the ceiling. Here he took his blankets and pillow and stuff, and he set it on top of the toilet and got it all on fire, and he had a big fire going in the cell. So I ran back to the radio room, got the jail key, the keys to open the door, and we dragged the prisoner out of there. The whole place was filling up with black smoke. And we dragged him all the way from the cell into the radio room, and he was lying on the floor, and I was certain that he had already passed away. He was not breathing. So we called for, at that time there weren't paramedics, but they were EMTs, because the ambulance service was fairly new at that time, and started doing CPR on this young man. And the person that was working on him was John Brunswick, who's passed away now, but he was the EMT, and he was doing CPR, and another EMT by the name of Joe Mangle was helping him. And I remember standing there watching, and all of a sudden the prisoner's eyes opened, and he started coughing, and when he could talk a little bit, he asked the EMTs, "Am I going to die?" At that point, he did not know that he had already was unconscious, not breathing, and they brought him back to life, transported him to the hospital, and to my knowledge, he never died, so he was alive. He went to court for his charges, and that was it. Another one was a female, and she was in a cell upstairs, and in those days they had to have a female, they called a matron, a female jailer. And this young lady was in jail for drug charges, marijuana charges, and she was pregnant. And she tore a ribbon off the sheet, and she hung herself in the doorway of the cell by her neck. And of course the matron, or the female jailer, right away screamed for help. There was a meeting going on the upstairs of the safety building, and the chief of police at that time was Howard Larson, and he ran over there and got a hold of her and lifted up on her and got the sheet untied. Took her to the hospital. She had already turned purple. Took her to the hospital, and the end result was she lived, and the baby was born later, and the baby was normal. So it was another very close attempted suicide, but not successful in killing themselves.
Do you have any theory on why people do that, and why they get to jail and then they just want to do themselves in?
Well, I think sometimes they're overwhelmed by, like, this is the end. I got these charges. Believe it or not, they taught us in school that a prominent businessman, very successful person that's in business, and maybe he gets picked up at night for drunk driving. He's a type of person that might attempt suicide, and it's based mostly on embarrassment and like I'm a family man, and what are my kids going to think? And they think the way is to end it, and they can be a very potential person for attempting suicide.
So that's part of your training then as a jailer was to be aware of those situations.
Oh, sure. And as time went on and we went to school, they had to have 30-minute checks on prisoners where you actually went in and checked on the prisoner. When the Wilsons escaped, no one checked on them. After supper, there was no lockdown, there was no checking on, so they went for 8 or 10 hours and no one even checked on them. Well, that's not the way it's run today. Yeah. So another one was in those days you would let the prisoner make phone calls, and we had a long cord that we could plug in and pass it into different cells. And he had his phone, and he made some phone calls, and he decided to attempt suicide and wrapped the cord around his neck. And when I found him, he was already turned purple, his face, and took him to the hospital, and he survived and was not a successful suicide. And the fourth one was a prisoner that slashed his wrist. And as I remember it, he went to the hospital for sutures, but there was a lot of blood, but he didn't bleed to death. So that was not so. But those four really stand out in my mind, and here I am retired, since 98, and I remember those because you just don't forget stuff like that.
You mentioned calling the EMTs for one of your four. This is a question I'm going to put to you based on your county board experience now. And the fact that Door County is unique in having a county-run ambulance department as opposed to 70 of the other 71 counties in Wisconsin have their ambulance service operated by fire departments and the like. So it's a county department. There are paramedics on duty 24 hours a day. I believe there are 3 crews that are always on duty. What's your thought on the level of service that is provided here in Door County compared with other places?
We probably at this point have, if not the best, one of the best paramedic services in the entire state of Wisconsin. In fact, maybe even across the nation. But I can tell you how it all started. Early in my career, the mortuaries went, when people called and their husband had a heart attack or something, they called the mortuaries in those days. Mm-hmm. Because they had the hearse and they could go pick people up. Well, they announced under Sheriff Bridenhagen, they put an article in the Advocate that they were no longer going to do that. They picked up cadavers or people that had passed away, and they were not going to be in the rescue business. So Sheriff Bridenhagen took it upon himself that we have to have a ambulance service where we can help the people of Door County. So he purchased an Oldsmobile, was the first one that you could put a gurney in to haul people. And they hired Fritz Brunswick was the first person that operated that, and radio operators actually were the drivers in those days. And it ran like that for a year or more, and then they knew they had to hire full-time people. The fire departments really the only full-time fire department that Door County had was in Sturgeon Bay. And of course, all the fire departments in northern Door County and southern Door County were volunteer. So it really wasn't an option for them to do it. So that Door County became one of the only counties that was county run. And like I said, in those days, there were EMTs, and they were at home. They had to leave home, and when the radio room would call them and say they had a call, either out of Sister Bay or out of Sturgeon Bay, and they would rush in and then go and try to attempt to save the person if it was a heart attack victim or an accident. Because during that period when before the ambulance, the Door County Traffic Department, which later became all of the Door County Sheriff Department, the squad cars were station wagons. They were all station wagons, and they had a gurney in the back. So when they arrived at an accident scene and people were hurt bad, the deputy would, with help from citizens, would get this person loaded on a gurney, put it in the station wagon, and drive into the hospital. And probably 100% of the time, no one was taking care of the patient. They were back there by themselves, and some cases bleeding bad or whatever their injuries were, and you got them into the emergency room, and that's the way it was done in those days. Yeah. And people, maybe a lot of, especially the younger people, don't realize, the service we have today compared to where it was, back in those days.
I think that since, again, I'll mention that we got 3 Vietnam veterans in this room right now, my opinion is that it was the level of medical attention that we received in Vietnam that has directly led to the kind of service that you take for granted today. Because there were times when people were presumed dead, but we put them in medevac choppers, got them back to the field hospitals, and 2 months later they were back on the line with us.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I'm happy to live so close to such an excellent medical care system, in my humble opinion.
That's right.
Yeah.
Door County is such a unique county in being a long, slender county. Basically, most of the county surrounded by water. It's not like other counties in the state where they might have 4 neighbors on 4 sides of their county when things happen where they can get help. And that's not the case in Door County. Being surrounded by water, that's why we have 5 different school systems. And they're spread out where probably a lot of counties maybe have a centrally located one that can handle it. But being a long, slender county makes it more difficult for law enforcement, makes it more difficult for the ambulance service, the fire department, the school system. It's just the way our layout, and then that 5th school system is up on Washington Island. Of course, and there they have their own. They have to provide everything for themselves up there, but they have an ambulance up there and a fire department and school system, and they're definitely part of Door County, but they're really isolated, being an island.
So you came back to Door County after you got out of the service. Were you born here in Sevastopol?
I was born in Sturgeon Bay. My mother and dad, Lawrence and Jen Verley, lived in Sturgeon Bay, and Sharon's mother and dad, George and Edna Jensen, when I married Sharon, her dad was the fire chief. George Jensen was chief at that time. So we're both natives. We were born and raised actually in what's called the Dorchester now. That was the hospital back in those days, and we were both born there. And the only time that I've really been away for any length of time was my 4 years in the Navy. I've been, my wife and I have traveled throughout the world. In fact, I took her back to Vietnam. I took her to where I was stationed a few years ago, so she saw the villa where I lived and the airfield. But, so we've been on vacations where we're gone for a couple of weeks, but being gone for 4 years, that was really the only long period of time where I was out of Door County or out of Sturgeon Bay.
How did it feel to go back to Vietnam and go back to where you were?
I guess for me, I always talked about to my wife of wanting to go back and go, and she said, Biz, if you want to go, you're going to have to go by yourself. She just didn't care to go. She was too afraid. And I was talking about it probably even prior to President Clinton. When he was president of the United States, he's the one that started the import-export out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
When that happened under President Clinton, that opened up the tourist industry in Vietnam. Today, it's a very, very popular place that thousands and thousands of people visit Vietnam now. And when I went back, it wasn't just to where I was stationed. We started in Hanoi, and where John McCain was held for 5 years at the Ho Lo prison. The Hilton, I guess the prisoners called it then. The Hanoi Hilton.
Yep.
But that's the Ho Lo prison, which is a museum today, and tourists can go there. And we started up and that's way in the north end of Vietnam, and we traveled through major cities all the way down through the entire country over 3 weeks, and ended up in Can Tho where I was stationed. And I hired a cab, and the two of us went away from our group. We were traveling with Grand Circle, but pictures that I had taken back in '66. For instance, the big Catholic church in downtown Saigon, which is Ho Chi Minh City today, with the real tall steeples.
Been there, seen that.
It's there today, and it's the same.
Yeah.
There's gardens in front, and they changed the landscape, but the building is basically the same as when I was there in the '60s, is there that today, along with the post office and all the major buildings in Saigon. I had pictures of them, and down on the waterfront, there's that building with the big clock, and that's all there yet today.
Yeah.
Saigon was never bombed, so none of those buildings were destroyed.
That was because of us guys in 199th Light Infantry. We kept the VC out of Saigon.
Yeah.
That was our task. That was our job, was
Sure.
to do the perimeter around the city.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
So-
I'm pretty much out of questions. I do have one thing to point out again. If you hold up your picture of you on your retirement in the jail, you mentioned that was photographed by Keita Steves. Keita she passed away several years ago, but she was a longtime reporter for the Door County Advocate. And I started writing a column for the Advocate about the same time that Keita was sort of winding down, and we discovered that we share a birthday. The same day was the birthday for the two of us, and so we just nodded at each other and happy birthday kind of thing. Biz, I'm just delighted to have done this interview. Did I give you any, or did I eliminate? No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Am I cutting you off when you still have tales to tell?
No, not really. We could sit here for another hour or two,
Yeah.
and I could tell you all kinds. Obviously over 30 years, a lot of stuff happened.
Yeah.
One other thing I just want to mention, and I don't think they do it nowadays, but back in those days, Baldy being the person that he was, when the computer system was developed, and you could get pretty instant information on people, all you needed was their name and their date of birth.
Yeah.
And you could plug it into the computer, and it would come up if there were any outstanding warrants or stuff. So what he did, and he did this over a couple of summers, he would go out to the Door County Fair and go to the main office. Usually it was one of those semi-trailers, the office, and he would say to the owner of the fair that I would like to have the name and date of birth of all your employees that are running these rides. All of them. So he would come back to the communication room with 25 or 30 names and date of births. And we'd run them in the computer, and lo and behold, 8 or 10 of them, there'd be outstanding warrants for them. And the owner of the fair would say, "You're going to put me out of business. I have no one to run the rides." He said, "Well, these people are all have warrants from places that you've been where maybe they're charged with a sex assault or they're charged, and they're wanted." And he did that a couple of years, and I remember that being, yeah, these people were wanted and had to go to court, but it really was devastating to the fair because he needed, these people were people that traveled with the fair and ran the rides.
Carnies, I think.
The carnies. They were usually they weren't dressed in suits. They had a little grease on their hands from putting rides together. But in those days that was done, and that's one of the things that he did over a couple of years. And then I don't think they did it anymore.
But probably by that time the reputation had been made, and the owners of the carnival would come to town knowing that they don't have any employees who are wanted.
I wouldn't doubt that if they would have got that, so names and date of births of everyone at the fair that we had just this past week, there might have been a couple of them that had outstanding warrants. But I don't think they do that anymore. But no, like I said, we could talk here about Vietnam. We could talk about the Door County Sheriff's Office. And today they got their brand new building that it's already, about 10 years old. Actually, when I ran for county board, after I retired in '98, in 2000, I took out papers. And I wanted to get on the county board. And the main reason I wanted to get on the county board was to get the new jail built. I knew how bad we needed it. And at that time, Leo Zipper was the county board chairman. And the county board wanted to borrow $30 million to build a justice center and to build a new highway garage and to build the ambulance at Sister Bay. And of course, there was a lot of opposition, and it wound up being a recall election, and most of us lost our seat on the county board. Yeah. And it was mainly because the people that were against this whole thing were really not telling the public the absolute truth. I know in my district, they went around and said, "Biz is on, he's your representative, and he wants to build a $30 million jail." It's insane. Well, that was not true, because they were going to build a justice center, which was the entire judicial system. The jail, yes, but the courtrooms, the district attorney's office, the child support, the clerk of court, all of the judicial system was in that justice center. The jail was just a small part of it. And then, of course, that $30 million was also for the highway shop and the ambulance. So they weren't really telling the truth when they said I wanted to build a $30 million jail. And of course, I lost my seat. But then the following April, all of us that lost our seat in the recall election, I think all of us got right back on the county board when the public found out the real truth. So, yeah, I saw the building get built, and we're using it today, and we've got other accomplishments since then. I've been on the board, and right now the thing that's going on is the new senior center, community center, whatever.
I'm just about to segue into that, yeah.
And then the brand new ambulance garage. And if you will, I'll just tell you a little bit of how that happened.
If I can interrupt for just 1 second, Biz is the chairman of the county board's property committee. So he's in a real good spot to tell this story. So I'm sorry.
So where the existing senior center is, the plan was to build a new center just on the south side of it, which would go into the parking lot of the John Miles Park out at the fairgrounds. Well, I knew from being a native that whole area is all wetland that was filled in. It's not a high ground area. That parking lot, sure, today it's a beautiful gravel parking lot, but they put in thousands of yards of fill in there and filled that in. Well, it turned out when they drew the building up and how they were going to do the water retention, they wanted to put an underground system in to hold the water and release it gradually. And it was going to be a high maintenance thing, and the county board was not really full, supporting of doing that. The other thing was they were going to build a new paramedic and ambulance garage on property that was owned by Door County Memorial Hospital. And we told Leo Zipper and others that we want to buy the property. We don't want to lease the property like we currently are doing right now, where the ambulances, right now as we sit here and talk, we're leasing from the Door County Memorial Hospital. And they would like us to leave because they have big plans of what they're doing on that side of the hospital. So I knew that there wasn't a lot of support on the county board to get into a lease agreement with Door County Memorial Hospital. So after a meeting in the government center, at the time the chairman of the county board was Dan Austed. And I said to Dan, that's sitting there, I said, Dan, we're always trying to figure out what to do with that old highway shop that we're renting to Palmer Johnson's. I said, do you suppose that building has got enough square footage to not only put the senior center there, but also the ambulance? And his answer to me was, boy, that building with all those garage doors, it's huge. He said, I wouldn't be surprised, that building is so big.
For those who aren't familiar, the building we're talking about, or the business talking about, is on 14th Avenue. Essentially just south of the CVS pharmacy at Egg Harbor Road and 14th. And if you drive by for the next several months, you'll see that construction is taking place. Back to you, sir.
So, and I remember his words clearly. The chairman of the county board, Dan Austed, said to me, you're chairman of the property committee. Why don't you call a special meeting and see what the committee thinks of it? So I did. I got a hold of the county clerk, Joe Lau. I said, I want to call a special meeting. And I can tell you we had the meeting, we talked about renovating that building and making both of those departments there. And we got a 100% vote to do a study. They said, we'll do a study and we'll see what a firm, and we wound up hiring Venture Architects, to have them go in there and look at the whole thing and come back to us with a report on whether they think it's feasible to do something like this. And of course, to make a long story short, months later after that study came back, the answer was, that building could be renovated. That's an old building, but it's a sturdy building. It could be made into a Door County Senior Center community and house the ADRC, the adult disability people, and all of the that department. And then on the north end, save some of those garage areas for ambulance and their sleeping quarters and for the paramedics. And it's all under renovation as we sit here and talk.
And you expect to bring it in for a little under 10 million, right?
That was the way it's worded, that it would be just under $10 million to do this. And I can tell you from the last reports that I got and going through there, they're ahead of schedule. They originally said we'd be able to move in January of 2018, both departments. And now they're saying December move in, because they want a demolition, the old senior center, once they're out, because that's also going to become part of the parking lot. And they feel that they'll be able to do it, once they're out, that this winter, that building will come down and that'll become part of the parking lot. And I'm not gonna say it's gonna be completely done, like landscaping, paving, everything complete, but the inside of the building would be ready for both departments to move in. So.
It's probably a good point to end the discussion. This has been a delight. I see that an hour has gone by and it doesn't feel like it to me.
No.
You've been watching Access Door County on Sevastopol Television. Again, I'm Pete Devlin. Our guest is Richard Biz Verley. You might call him a Renaissance man, Vietnam vet, sheriff's deputy, county board member, and probably a few other things that I didn't think of. Thank you very much for watching us.